Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this month's webinar. My name is Tim Dietrich, and I'm the Director of Professional Services with Mortarstone. And alongside me today is our co-founder, David Thurman. And we have a very special guest today, Andrew Winger from Cross City Church in Fresno, California. And we're so excited to have Andrew with us today. So we want to begin today and talk about several things specifically, Andrew, to how we have worked with you at Cross City and how that has just kind of helped you with your stewardship and generosity ministry there. But before we do that, let's begin by just giving us a little bit of a history of who Andrew is and what your role is there at Cross City.
Yeah, for sure. So I provide leadership to finance, HR, our preschool that we operate on campus, as well as our stewardship and generosity ministries. So I have an accounting degree from Davenport University, working on my MBA from Oklahoma State University. I'm really excited to complete that in the next year or so. In regards to Cross City's been around since about 1959. So about 65 years old. It's an ag community. So we're a huge exporter of crops, specifically like almonds, grapes, pistachios. Our economy is really driven by the ag industry, which creates a lot of interesting dynamics. Our fund development director, Scott Johnson, he's always said there's a lot of farmers around here with private jets in their pole barns. So that's kind of the environment that we're in here at Cross City.
That's great, Andrew, and that's really helpful because a lot of our participants today probably are not familiar with the lay of the land in California in terms of ministry and church work. But California is not the only place you served, right? Where else have you served?
Yeah, so I started my career as a CFO at a zoo in Lansing, Michigan. I'm from Grand Rapids, Michigan originally. And then I served as interim executive director there for a short time period, and God used that situation to call me into ministry. Served at Peace Church in Middleville, Michigan, just south of Grand Rapids, Michigan, as the executive director of operations. So kind of an executive pastoral role.
Okay, excellent, outstanding. So
Andrew, how big is Cross City Church? Like, are you guys? I don't think you're multi-site, but give me a little background of your senior pastor tenure, kind of that leadership structure, decision-making structure, all that sort of stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're an elder-led church. Our lead pastor, David Rutherford, is an elder. He's served at Cross City for about 27 years now. So he's a long-term pastor. We have about 5,000 attendees each weekend. So pretty large operation, 85 staff members. We just surpassed the $10 million budget amount this past year. So pretty large church.
And you do that in one location. Is that a fair statement, or is that accurate?
Yep, we just have one campus, and then we have what we refer to as our online campus.
Got it. Thank you.
Outstanding. So, Andrew, let's talk a little bit about what are the 2 or 3 big things that Cross City is about that you're trying to accomplish there in Fresno.
We've got some internet delay, I think.
Yeah, so my goal here at Cross City is to really build a culture.
I think Andrew cut out. Is that a fair statement?
I'm sorry, I can attempt to call in here.
Andrew, you're so far in the country, you guys don't have internet, it sounds like.
Well, that's part of the agricultural thing. So, David, while we're getting Andrew back online, talk to us a little bit about how you and how we at Mortarstone first became connected with Andrew.
Yeah, that's a great segue here. So Andrew in Cross City has been an analytics customer for several years. They've also engaged with us in coaching to build their stewardship and generosity ministry. I also have worked with Andrew on working with their givers. And so I've had several interactions with their givers as kind of a lay staff person to Cross City. So I'm pretty familiar with the organization, the leadership, the staff, et cetera, just in our coaching role with these guys. And so I've worked with them for a few years. I've helped structure gifts literally at the 11th hour, where people have been up against a tax deadline and they've wanted to give sizable gifts, sizable assets, and have worked basically as a staff person, even though I'm not on staff, but as an adjunct staff person, if you will, to facilitate, close those gifts. So they've just been a blessing to work with. They've been a great church. And they're one of those churches that you would never expect. When he says they're an agrarian area, Fresno, if people aren't familiar with the West Coast, it's right kind of smack in the middle of California. And when he says it's agrarian or agricultural type setting, it's hugely diverse with origin, ethnicity. And so you'll have people that are, barely can speak English, as well as people that own 1,000-acre farms, if you will, in that church. And so it's very diverse. And their pastor, Pastor David, has basically built that church, even though it was maybe established in the 60s. For most of the last 27 years, it's David's DNA all over that church. And so you have a very tenured pastor, tenured leadership, and a tenured constituency that loves that pastor, the leadership, the vision, and everything that they do in that community. So it's just been a blessing to work with. It's been really fun to build out their case for support because they have their fingers in so many things that they're doing. And they're really kind of an iconic church in that Central Valley.
Okay. That brings a question to mind, something you just said, David, the impact of having a tenured pastor. How do you see in churches that, not just churches we work with, but just in your experience overall, what are some of the key differences between, someone who is emerging in a church, just been maybe in that congregation 2 or 3 years, over and against someone like Cross City, who's been there for 25 or 27 years? What are some of the nuances between that pastoral leadership, tenure-wise?
Yeah, it's a loaded question. I can go a mile deep with that one. We work with a lot of older, established churches that are led by their founding pastors or grown by those pastors. So again, their DNA is all over it. That presents two problems, though. For the thought leading pastor, they will position that church in a way that will set them up for a good, healthy succession. In other words, they won't straddle that next generation of leader with the old pastor's vision debt, if that makes sense. And that's a big piece of thinking through, hey, we do have a tenured pastor. Oh, it looks like Andrew's back. He's on the phone, though. Nikki, can you work with Andrew and try and get him back into the panel discussion? Because he just sent me a text and he said he's on, but he's not on the panelist side of the house.
Not a problem.
So working with tenured pastors it's great if they are forward thinking enough to say, yeah, I don't want to transfer $6 or $8 or $10 million of debt of my vision to the next pastor in 5 years. So they got to be a little bit more of a thought leader to think through, hey, what does this potentially look like? And so those that are forward thinking, they get it, they know it. We work with a fantastic church in Plymouth, Michigan, where one of the pastor's basically hallmarks is, hey, this has been my vision for the last 20 plus years. I'm one day going to pass the mantle, and I sure don't want to straddle that new leader with my debt or my vision. The other upside of that, though, Tim, is working with the more tenured givers at the church. If you have a tenured pastor or a pastor moving into an emeritus type role, huge credibility as you start to like talk with your 60 plus year olds about a planned gift. A planned gift was basically just a major gift. It's a gift that would basically come from the asset side of their giving versus from their income side of their giving. And that is huge when you have that person in a role that a trustworthy role for 2+ decades, and then they're forward thinking enough to think, hey, this is probably not my church, it's God's church, and potentially even a different leader is going to be stepping in at some point. So how do we position it for best success down the road? Andrew, thanks for joining us.
Yeah. And David and Andrew, that's, we're raising a lot of really interesting things, I think, that are right at the heartbeat. And so for the people who are watching, if you have questions that you would like to drop into the chat, we would encourage you to do that. We're going to try to carve a few minutes at the end of the webinar to be able to do some more Q&A type things, but please feel free to drop those things into the chat as we go. So, well, Andrew, welcome back. We're glad you're here.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm so sorry about that. Usually my internet's rock solid. This time it was my laptop died on me. So unfortunate, but thanks for having me.
All right. Well, listen, we want to kind of pick back up on the conversation that we were having with you and your work at Cross City, and we want to talk a little bit about how you're trying to build a culture of generosity at Cross City. What are some of the things that you're doing to try to build that culture? What are some of maybe the concerns that you have that you would like to address? Talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so honestly, my concerns were what led me to engage with Mortarstone in the first place. One of the biggest concerns I have is just the wealth transfer that's incoming. Now, the baby boomers and the silent generation are slated to pass along, I think the statistics like $68 trillion when they pass. So, I mean, as a church, the stakes are just too high and our vision is too big not to want to capitalize off of that opportunity. And in my experience, a little bit in the nonprofit world, colleges and universities, the zoo that I had worked at in the past, we're not afraid to talk about money and legacy. So why shouldn't the single most important organization in the world, which is the local church, why can't they talk about this? So that was probably my first concern. Secondly, the younger generation, my generation, I'll say it, I'm a millennial. I don't identify as one, but I am a millennial. You're an old soul,
yeah, Andrew.
I like to think that. But honestly, if we're banking on my generation to tithe to fund our ministries for the millennial generation on down, I mean, we're in trouble, and all the statistics will support that, as well as our Mortarstone profile. But I mean, that doesn't mean that we throw in the towel with this group. We need to be unafraid about talking about money, and it's not about what the church wants from you. It's what we want for you. And living that life of generosity and effective stewardship is just, it's an amazing place to be once you get there.
That's awesome.
Any other concerns that you're looking into or think about as you think about building out a generosity ministry there at Cross City?
Yeah, I would say maybe the last thing would be having a fully funded ministry into the future. And that's like what David had mentioned. We have this incredible pastor, Pastor David, who's left such a legacy in the 27 years that he's been the lead pastor. How do we ensure that he's not leaving debt along with him? I know that's something that he doesn't want to do, and that our elder board has communicated that we want to be debt free. And we need to build out that culture of generosity if we want to make that happen.
Great. So then let's talk a little bit about, you've talked about some of the big pictures, Andrew, and that's all been tremendous. So how has Mortarstone helped you? I mean, you've mentioned a couple of times that's what led you to engage Mortarstone. So let's be a little more specific about that if we can. How have we been
Sure.
helpful to you?
Oh, so helpful. I mean, from a software perspective, the insights that we garner, it's one of those things with data. It's beautiful to have, but if it's not actionable, and if you're not going to provide context to what that data actually means, it's garbage. So what's great about Mortarstone is you guys have helped us navigate our data, really using it kind of a two-track approach, an operational track and a spiritual track. So operationally, we need to attract and retain giving households, just from a real tactical perspective. And to do that, we have our first time giver processes, our second time giver processes, our lapsed giver processes. We want to know when somebody has lapsed in their giving, not because we want to say, hey, where's your money? But rather it's a pastoral opportunity. It's a chance to check in and say, hey, maybe this person's upset with something that we said from the pulpit on Sunday. Maybe they're going through a divorce and their financial situation has changed substantially that they can't give to the church. Whatever that is, we want to meet those people right where they're at, and care for them. So I say that operationally. Now spiritually is the second track. And are we growing generous disciples? Because that's what we're here to do. And Mortarstone's helped tremendously with that as well.
Good. So who all have you worked with on the Mortarstone team?
I think we've worked with about 8 people. It really is like it's an extension of our staff. I think you may have mentioned that. I'm sorry, my internet is or laptop wasn't working when you discussed that, so I got just a little snippet of it. But you really are. I view you, Tim, as an extension of the staff. David, I can call you. I have your cell phone number if I have a question. It really is a team approach, and I know that might sound, cliche or whatever, but it really is. It's an extension of our team at Cross City. Churches aren't known for having a robust staff, so the fact that we get experts as an extension of us is just a tremendous blessing.
Excellent. Well, thank you for those very gracious and kind words. Let's talk a little bit about some of the foundational strategies that you guys are working through at Cross City. What are some of the things that you are doing to lay a foundation for a tremendous and a strong generosity ministry?
Yeah, so our foundational document is, we call it the theology of advancement. That's answering the question, why do I give? Just biblically speaking, what is tithing versus generosity? We believe at Cross City that tithing is giving 10% of your first fruits. So the first 10% that comes in, not the after the government has taken their withholdings, but rather the first 10% is to go back to the kingdom. So we really wanted to define that in that document. The document lays out 4 biblical principles that are rooted in scripture, and then 4 accompanying applications for those principles and how we actually apply it to our people. And again, I said this earlier, but it's rooted in what we want for them, not what we want from them. And I think that's a really important distinction. So that's kind of like the foundation, the theology advancement. Why do I give? Then you have the case for support, which is the why do I give through Cross City? And that is a tremendous responsibility on us to clarify our vision for the church. A question, Tim, that I like that you ask frequently is, hey, if I dropped $1 million in your offering plate, what would you do with that? And so us as a church need to define exactly what we would do with that. A kingdom-minded, God-inspired vision for the future, which we've developed and put in a document that we can give to our high capacity donors. And again, that's called the case for support. And then the third piece of the foundation for us is just what I mentioned earlier, and access to an expert at the ready. I've always sought to surround myself with experts and mentors, and Mortarstone and your whole team have been tremendous, to the point where I'm calling David on Christmas Eve in the airport, facilitating this really complex gift that I think we'll talk about in a little bit. But yeah, so those are kind of the three things that are a foundational strategy for us here at Cross City.
Okay, and so Andrew, I'm curious, how have you been communicating your theology of advancement, your case for support, or how do you plan to communicate those things to your givers? Because if you guys do all of that work, I mean, it's pretty easy for that to just become a notebook on a shelf, right? What are
Absolutely.
we doing with that information?
Yeah, so one of the ways that we use that information is through a lot of seminars that you guys put on for us that are really, really helpful. We have one coming up October 1st and 2nd. It's our personal estate design workshop, and our estate planning workshop is going to be with that as well. So really getting people thinking about, what kind of legacy do I want to leave? My resources need to follow my values. And so we'll use that at that seminar. And honestly, the case for support is still in progress at the moment. So we plan to put that in front of as many high capacity givers as we possibly can.
I got a question or a comment. And I think what you just said, Andrew, is huge for most churches. Is that case for support is what we would call internally is an evergreen document. So as your vision, as your God-inspired vision, as you're led by God to do fill in the blank, that doesn't have to be consistent for the next 10 years. It can change, and it should change as God inspires you, the community, the needs, etc. And so when you said that case for support's not done, I've seen versions of it being done, but now it's redrafting because you guys have a big vision that you want to start to tackle, and you're post-COVID, for lack of a better word, and it's easier to kind of like really think through the facility needs and the parking, the ingress, the egress, all those sort of things start to open back up as we emerge post-COVID, right? And so absolutely your vision should change. Therefore, your case for support should be changing with it. That doesn't mean your overall mission has changed, rather just some of the things that you're trying to march towards has. So thank you for clarifying that.
Yeah, absolutely.
So Andrew, this sounds like a lot of work. And when you introduced at the top of the hour, you mentioned that you had, multiple hats that you wear at Cross City. I mean, this isn't just the only thing you do. You obviously have some other responsibilities that are also very demanding on your time. So how do you manage this? How do you create the bandwidth within your team to be able to accomplish, these very aspirational goals for generosity and gift planning? Yeah,
I mean, first I would say it's worth carving out time for because of the return on investment. So it's worth time, but honestly, it's not as daunting as it might seem, especially considering, I know I mentioned this earlier, but I really do view Mortarstone's team as an extension of ours. You're able to really give us the tools and resources to where you guys just pretty much tee it up for us and we have to execute. A real tangible example of this is this morning, Tim, when we met. I had a Zoom meeting and was given a full 90-day marketing plan for our next upcoming seminar. And so it's like, here's everything you need to do, Andrew. Now just go execute with your team. So that makes it much, much more manageable of a process than what it sounds like.
Okay, great. So again, for those of you who are joining us live, we want to remind you that you're welcome to put questions in the chat or the Q&A, and we'll address those as we go along, and definitely at the end of the webinar today. So please feel free to utilize those. We want to welcome everybody again who's with us. So Andrew, when people normally talk about planned giving, they normally think about it in terms of, well, that's leaving the church in your will for a testamentary gift when you pass away. But what have you come to learn about planned giving and major gift ministry that maybe has shifted in that process?
Yeah, I mean, I think the idea of leaving something to your local church upon your death is a really important thing to do. But that's really just getting your foot in the door when you talk about generosity. I mean, I don't know about you, but like I would like to see my legacy played out here on earth before I'm on the other side of eternity. So there's just so many different ways that you can use you've got your normal outright cash gifts, you have split interest gifts, you have, like I said, end of life gifts. There's so many different possibilities, and the beauty of it is that I don't have to understand all the nuances and the technical terms, nor do I care to, or the legal definitions of different things. But you guys take care of that for me, which is a huge blessing.
Okay. David, Andrew has kind of touched on 2 or 3 things there at a very high level. Why don't you, for the people on our webinar, break down a little bit more in detail what we mean by an outright gift, a split interest gift, and an end of life gift?
Sure. So if you think about church funding, they're funded by annual gifts and capital campaign gifts as a rule. And if you broaden that context of philanthropy into non-faith nonprofits, they're typically funded by capital campaign gifts and plan gifts, and then a smaller portion of that revenue might come from annual gifts, if you will. And so if you look at, say, higher education as a model, they're going after what we would call is major planned gifts. They're staffed to do that. They have what you call a major gift officer whose sole role is to go build relationships with alumni and get those guys to participate in investing in the next generation of students. And that's what they do very, very successfully. It's why churches are able to do billion-dollar universities, health and human service organizations, larger paraministries. They can do a billion-dollar capital campaign or multi-billion-dollar capital campaign, whereas churches sometimes struggle to do 1 or 2x of their annual giving with a capital campaign. And so what we want to kind of introduce with our church partners and the givers is you should be thinking about kind of 2 buckets to give: your annual giving, which is your tithing, and then your estate giving. And that estate giving opens up a large arsenal of really where people's wealth is held. And it's typically in what we call non-cash assets. I'm not necessarily speaking about, say, an art, an art collection or an old car or a boat. Those aren't things that we want. Rather, we want to help people understand what is a non-cash gift. It could be stock. It could be business interest. It could be low cost basis stock where there's going to be a big tax or taxable burden if it's liquidated or repositioned. And so then through a strategy of what we call blended gift, we help givers think through ways that they can not only give an outright gift, but maybe even endow a ministry. They might be able to give a life income gift, and that's arguably a charitable gift annuity or a pooled income fund trust. Split interest gift simply means I can give $1 million to the church, but then I get an income stream for life. And then when I die, that asset remains the property of the church. And that's a huge benefit to the nonprofit world. And the churches, faith-based organizations, are largely the only ones not talking about that, especially as taxes are set to go up, especially when taxes are going to increase, estate tax exemptions are going to be expiring. All those sort of things are set for our federal government, which is what I would call our non-philanthropic partner. They have about 80,000 pages of tax code that says this is our portion of what we're supposed to get, either from income, from investments, or estate. And so they're going to be with you from cradle to grave, I like to say. And so how do we kind of help position our givers to give or direct those tax dollars to the cause of Christ? And that's really a planned gift. And so there again, that's the blended strategy where we want to make sure the annual church needs are met and they're funded. Any capital projects we can start to go after, we can do that. And then what does that look like to kind of give some complex strategies, both during life as well as at end of life?
That's a lot of information in a very short amount of time, David. We do have a question that came in through our Q&A channel, and I want to go ahead, since we're on the topic of this, and pass that to you. How are you seeing churches that work with us talk about donor advised funds with high capacity donors, and do we have a defined strategy around that? Talk to us a little bit about donor advised funds and how those could maybe be best used.
Yeah, a donor advised fund, they're hugely popular with people who technically understand charitable giving, if you will. And I think one of the stigmas around DAFs, donor advised funds, the acronym is DAF. So if I refer to it as that, as what it means, a donor advised fund, a DAF. The kind of some of the concerns, for lack of a better word, that charitable organizations might have is DAF balances are growing exponentially, and those distributions aren't really matching that growth, if that makes sense. So the one thing that you want to be careful for or of is you roll out a giving through a donor advised strategy, and most people were going to do that the easy way, the low lying fruit, if you will, is simply fund that DAF with either cash or appreciated assets. And then you take your charitable deduction, but then those assets can continue to grow before they're distributed to the charity by way of a grant request. And so DAFs are extremely beneficial for people who want to take advantage of a standard deduction or itemizing versus taking the standard deduction. They're extremely effective at dumping large asset pools into a charitable vehicle, so it's not taxed, and then they can be distributed at a later date. But every church should be able to speak to, confidently educate some of their quote unquote higher capacity givers to be able to utilize a donor advised fund for their charitable giving.
And that's a good point, David, because in the last Giving USA report that was just released earlier this month, we saw that 6% of all philanthropic giving in 2021 was done through a donor advised fund. So they're becoming more and more popular as we see trends move forward.
So think about that just for a second, and let's contextualize that through your local church. So everyone that's on this call, did 6% of your giving come in from a DAF? Question mark to our audience, and if not, why? Because we're again remiss in being able to teach this within the context of a church. And this is going to be impromptu. I hope I don't throw you a curveball, Tim, but do you have statistics on how much money went into philanthropy from bequest or testamentary gifts? I think
it was probably 14%.
Yeah, 14%.
Or
so. So now look at that as additional piece. Did 14% of your funding come in from testamentary gifts or bequest? Question mark to the church. So 20% of funding going to philanthropy is coming from end of life gifts and DAFs. And if you don't have 20% giving coming in from non-traditional methods, that should be a pause for concern, if you will. It's like, what are we missing that the overarching industry, the overarching nonprofit sectors, higher education, health and human services, arts and humanities, what are these guys figured out that we're not really teaching or doing effectively well to where we're effectively funding our ministries with alternative strategies other than quote unquote cash?
Yeah, and the opportunity there is tremendous. And what I want to do, David, with the conversation at this point is I want to segue and bring Andrew back into the conversation a little bit and talk about, what does it actually look like and feel like Andrew, to see one of these gifts come in. Typically, and again, I was a pastor for 3.5 decades, and for the longest time, it was kind of like pass the plate, and there's the income that you have for the month or for the year. So, Andrew, talk to us about what happens when you have a significant gift come in, and the difference that makes in your church, and you and David can kind of interact about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So that, I think the one that comes to mind the most is the gift that I referenced, where I'm in the airport on December 24th, taking a call with David because we had an individual's father who attends the church. I'm sorry, the son attends the church. The father does not attend the church. The son says, "Hey, my dad has a tax problem, and he'd like to discuss it with you." To which I'm like, I don't know how to solve the tax problem for this guy, but I know who to call. So I call David, and we have a conversation between the three of us about how we could facilitate this pretty complex gift of real estate that he decided to give to the church. There was a split interest involved in it. It was his sister-in-law was allowed to live on the property until she goes into a home, but he wanted to donate its property worth $402,000. So, David, do you want to speak to that conversation that you had on Christmas Eve, I guess?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is important to really understand, because this is, if you kind of do a case study on this gift alone, it's really interesting, because it's like this guy, and Andrew, we giggled about this a little bit, but this guy has no charitable intent. And we asked him, he really didn't care about the charity per se. He needed a tax deduction. He needed a write-off. And so he was fine to give an asset by way of giving a life estate to his deceased brother's wife. So she was living in the house. She's in her mid-80s. So actuarially, she doesn't have a lot of years left. And so we had to kind of like rush to get a title report, open escrow, draft the legal constructs around that gift, get attorney on both sides for the church as well as for the donor to review the agreements, and then get everything recorded prior to December 31. And so it was one of those things that we had to get an appraisal on for valuation purpose, for deductions, a lot of boxes to check. And so, when I got the call, I was, and I love these types of calls. I don't necessarily love them on December 24th, but I love these types of calls because I just know what kind of an impact that can have. That's a major planned gift. And absent the planning, there would be no tax deduction for that guy. And when he passes, that he would just have a low cost basis asset that he needs to figure out with the estate. And so in this particular case, it's a win-win. He had no economic interest that he could take ongoing from that because of the life estate. And so it was just a great win-win-win for the donor, for the person living in the house, and for the church, who gets really an unencumbered, beautiful piece of real estate. And within probably 2-3 years, that person's vacating it for assisted living. And we have clear title to a property that we can, in essence, dispose of and add $400,000+ to the church's balance sheet for future ministry needs.
Wow.
Yeah.
So,
and I just need to reiterate too there that like it was a total God thing, because we had been building this foundation to be able to accept complex gifts up to this point. And then all of a sudden it became very urgent, and we were able to respond to it. And so that, I think that's a really important thing to highlight. It was incredible.
Yeah. And I'm just going to give props to Cross City's legal counsel, being David Middlebrook, and the church law group, because they responded equally responsive to review documents and to make sure that we weren't putting the church in a liability position. And so those guys did a fantastic job at the 11th hour, being able to review and provide insight into everything that we drafted.
Yeah.
That's great. So I really appreciate, David, you pointing out the collaboration between the givers, financial advisors and team, the church and the church's financial advisors and team. So we tell us a little more, David, about how we intend to try to work with churches and their teams and givers and their teams.
Yeah, well, my conversation was with Andrew with the church was extremely limited. You know, we got some key people, elder chair for signature purposes for the gift, but then I worked with the donor's legal counsel, our legal counsel, the church's legal counsel, to basically make sure all those, you know, I's were dotted and T's were crossed, and that we could facilitate getting escrow opened up, getting the clear title insured, and then basically getting that recorded for tax purposes for the donor's deduction at the end of the year. And so it was really, when I say we're like adjunct staff to the church, we have a certain expertise, skill set. We're Christ followers. We understand the vision of the church. We understand the theology of what the church is teaching, which aligns, you know, as a company that serves Christian churches, we proudly put our theology, our everything that we believe in on our website, because we do believe so importantly that we are an extension of your staff in situations like this. So that was just a really unique, cool gift under a really cool timeline. But there's other gifts that we can talk about or surface. Case in point, a low-level giver came to an event, and she's, you know, was approached by, she's got oil rights in Midland, Texas, of all places, and she lives in Fresno, California. But her oil rights are going from like $300 or $400 a month to $50,000 a month, and so she immediately has a massive income tax problem that she's got to start to wrestle with. She's got issues within her family structure, whereas her immediate heir, her daughter, not really trustworthy, but this person wants to make sure that her granddaughter has her education paid for. So there's so many cool, unique stories like that. That one, again, special to Cross City Church, where we can talk about different strategies to create generosity outside of the normal channels that the church has been accustomed to teaching to.
So Andrew, talk to us a little bit about, you know, as you look at this process and working with Mortarstone, talk to us a little bit about how you guys would evaluate the return on your investment. How has that worked when you think about the cost and the return?
Yeah, so I mean the ROI on, and we're talking hard dollars today, we're at about 5,000% return on investment, which is incredible, let alone the future landscape of being able to accept complex gifts like the one that David's talking about, or the two that David's talking about. We would be missing out on those opportunities had we not invested in this. So really it's, I mean, I say 5,000% in hard dollars. It's infinite when you look forward based on the opportunity cost, the decision not to have a foundation in place to be able to accept these gifts.
Wow, that's tremendous.
And I don't think that's really, thank you. I didn't know that number. Thank you, Andrew. But I think one thing that I think is super important here is most churches don't really know how to disciple people in this area. They just make an appeal for an outright gift, but they don't really do a lot to teach people of how to use your vernacular, Andrew or Tim. It's how do you transfer your values with your valuables? How do you kind of talk through the estate design process, not the legal documents, because that's the mundane pieces of it, but you've spent a lifetime creating wealth, and you're going to just pass it through, arguably without a lot of thought around the values that should be going with that wealth. And that's the discipleship piece that I think churches really need to kind of clue in on, because their sole mission is to disciple people. And if you're not discipling people that are, say, 60 years old or older in this area of estate design, being able to teach complex giving strategies, and why it's beneficial for the church, why it's discipleship. If you don't have proper case studies developed that you can show examples of how people can do this, that's really the bigger piece of this, because the money is the money, and of course churches need money, but more than almost anything, the 60-plus-year-olds are almost underserved in just about every church, and they don't really have a distinct ministry where it's tailored towards the things that are top of mind to them, which is positioning for retirement, positioning for passive income, thinking through transferring those assets. Am I going to blow up my kids' desire to work if I throw them $3 million or $5 million if I die? I mean, does that help them or hurt them? Those are some of the questions that they're thinking through, or they haven't thought through, and they should be.
Mhm. Yeah, traditional financial planning has kind of operated under the concept that, the most efficient transfer of wealth from one generation to another. I mean, that's the basic traditional view of secular financial planning. But what I hear you saying, David, is that kingdom-minded planning is not just about the efficient transfer of wealth, but it's transferring your values alongside that wealth. And that to me makes it very exciting, because that's going back to what Andrew said. We're not talking about fundraising at that point. We're talking about faith raising. And what a tremendous, and the scripture is full of these kinds of examples, if we just kind of have our eyes open to it. So, Andrew, any closing comments? David, final questions for Andrew before we turn to a couple of Q&A questions?
Andrew,
I have one thing that I'd like to highlight, if you don't mind.
yeah, please.
Please.
I'm sure most people on this call are familiar with Stephen Covey's time matrix. We talk about, you've got the 4 quadrants. In the top left, you've got urgent and important. Going to the right, not important, not urgent, urgent, not important, and then not urgent, not important. This fully falls into not urgent, but very, very, very important. And I just want to reiterate that, because we're not feeling, even with inflation as bad as it is, in our experience, we haven't seen a huge dip in our weekly giving and our tithes and offerings. I know that's not the case for a lot of churches, but if we wait for this wealth transfer of $68 trillion and we're not there, if the local church isn't there to capitalize off of that, and I mean that in a really positive way, I hope you know, we're not going to fully fund our vision. And that's kind of what it comes down to. It's not urgent right now, but it's very, very important. And that's what I'd like to summarize there.
That's a good concept. I'm going to plagiarize that.
Well, I butchered it, but you can do better.
Andrew,
Well,
we're not even going to give you credit for that.
Yeah, I think so many churches are, hey, we don't have the bandwidth for this. And I think they fail to realize how much of a turnkey solution this can be for them, because we get church staffing's limited. There's not really people sitting in church looking for things to do, right? So it's like, how do you kind of like weave some of these things in to where it doesn't feel like it's a burden or falls on one person's plate? And so, but that's an important concept that you brought up. It's like, hey, it's probably not urgent, but it's super important. And that's a good way to illustrate that with a man with a low handicap.
There you go. Yeah. Andrew's a scratch golfer, so that's
Yeah.
with numbers that way. So, David, do you have a final word? I've got one question here. Why don't I go ahead and get to that question? So Jason asks, would Andrew be willing to share some more about that theology advancement document or some of the processes that they worked through? And Jason, I know you had a more particular question there that we can address with you offline, but for the benefit of the whole, can you talk to us for a minute, Andrew, about, what does that theology of advancement document look like, and what did it take for you to get to that final product?
Yeah, so my laptop, which crashed, had it open, so I'll kind of go without the document. Um, but really, it was Mortarstone, you guys, Megan Brown, shout out to Megan, she's awesome. She gave us the framework and kind of the bones and the structure of what that document needs to look like, as well as some examples that other churches have done. And then we just, I like to call it cross-cityified it. We put our own language to it. We put our own culture to that example. So it was a really quick process, which was greatly helped by Megan's resources. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I think that's I think that's real important in that you covered, at a high level there, kind of what it took to get that. So who all on your team was involved in the development of that? I mean, you're talking about basically a theological white paper, right? So who all on your team was kind of had their fingerprints on that theology?
Yeah, so Brent Deffenbacher, our associate pastor, he had a lot to do with the verbiage and the vocabulary that we used in the document, as well as Pastor David, of course, our lead pastor, really needed to speak into it as well. And also Scott Johnson, our fund development director, helped us with that. So it was very much a team effort, very much peer reviewed, for lack of a better term, amongst our staff.
Yeah, Jason, we can get you a copy of that. I don't think Scott, or excuse me, Andrew, you would care, and if not, we can get you a kind of a version of what we would use internally with some of our church partners. So if we just make a note of that, Nikki or Tim, that we can connect with Jason and kind of share what some of the bones, as Andrew said, what that looks like, to give him some direction. That document, incidentally, if I could speak to a little bit to it, that's kind of foundational to how you view giving, and not just tithing, but generosity in general. And because most people will check the box, hey, I've already tithed, because that's what you've taught. Why are you asking for an estate gift? So that document becomes critical to how you view generosity, not just a current income based percentage gift, if that makes sense.
And that's a good point, David, because when we only talk about the tithe, then what happens in the minds of some givers, they would they hear it they hear that kind of as, oh, well, that's an unattainable standard, or I've hit the standard and I don't need to do anything else. And that's where the more fully fleshed out piece of theology helps us understand that, no, this is kind of a standard, but it's not the ceiling, neither is it the floor. This is something that we want to target, and God's intent, I think, is God doesn't need our money, right? I mean, if we're talking about the God that, so giving to me is a discipline that has to do more with our obedience and our faith than it does, God's need for money, if you will. And Andrew, I don't know if you want to speak into any of that or not, but that's just kind of how I see it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's, again, I think I've said it a couple times, but it's about what we want for you, not from you. It's viewing money the way that God sees it is transformative, and we want that for our people.
Yeah, that's
and
exactly
it's foundation. Right. It's foundational to, when you look at a church's giving page, most churches are willfully inadequate in this area to really talk about a holistic giving strategy or generosity strategy. Rather, they're usually, putting some scriptures up about tithe or a basic underlying principle, but they're really not fleshing out kind of a holistic approach to generosity, and using some examples of what Jesus is teaching it, not only in the New Testament, but also what's written in the Old Testament too about giving and whatnot. So that's a really important document, not to be taken lightly. So yeah, we're happy to share that and discuss or brainstorm with you guys.
Well, and we've had several who have kind of added in, they would like to see that as well. So when Nikki sends out the recording of today's webinar, we can hopefully add that to the recording so that people have access to it. If that's okay with you, Andrew, we'll share that, because I think it's a, Andrew, would you say yes or no?
Absolutely.
Yes.
Absolutely.
No? Well, but I mean, my question was yes or no. Was that a fulfilling process? I mean, was the theology of advancement, when you finished, was that a document you could be proud of? That's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Asking.
Yes. Absolutely. It absolutely is.
It's akin to going to the dentist and getting a molar pulled. Let's just be.
It's a lot of work, but the price is worth the fight, or whatever. So,
Yes.
Hey, I noticed in the Q&A, Brian Schwartz had a question. How are you discussing donor advised funds with high capacity donors? Do you have a defined strategy around that? Did you already ask me that question?
Yeah.
Okay, because I don't think I addressed it in that clear context, because I think you guys on this call have to think through a DAF is an on-ramp to a state balance sheet giving. And that's a massive concept. But we want to shift people's focus from giving from the little bucket, which is their checking account, to the big bucket, which is where all their assets are held. So a DAF fundamentally changes how a person gives, which is the most critical piece that we want to drive through. That's the psychology of generosity. It's like we're shifting their focus to think from, I can give a percentage gift of my income, to look at my big piece of assets. How do I give in a most tax advantaged way to accelerate generosity in the mission of my church? So donor advised fund is one key to being able to talk with givers about the bigger overarching strategy of a planned gift, or having a giving or generosity plan. So I don't think I discussed that in my earlier conversation, Brian, but I would, if anyone else wants to unpack that, that is a massive on-ramp. Just like everyone provides text to give or online giving, as an easy solution to capture a new giver or first-time giver, a donor advised fund is something that you should be routinely talking through your tenured givers, your more well-heeled givers to, and you should be providing examples of how people are positioning assets to give versus cash to give. And we have tons of marketing material, education material. We call them devotionals, case study devotionals, that you can send out to people that, hey, example, they've given a large gift. They gave a $5,000 cash gift. You would follow that up with not only thank you for the gift, but would you also consider giving stock in the future? These are some strategies I'd love to meet with you and have a cup of coffee about. So there's missed opportunities. Don't just put give from a DAF on your giving page, because that's not the solution, is what I'm trying to drive at. Sorry, I could hammer this thing to the ground, so I'll stop here.
Well, we are coming up on the top of the hour, and first and foremost, Andrew, on behalf of all of our viewers, whether they're live or on the recording, we at Mortarstone want to thank you for your time. We want to thank you for your transparency. I am so blessed by just kind of the very authentic way that you communicate your heart, whether it's when we're meeting or working together, or even on this webinar. So, Andrew, thank you for your authenticity. Andrew, would you mind sharing your church's website address in case anybody kind of wants to just poke around a little bit at what you're doing at Cross City? What's your website address?
Yeah, sure thing. It's mycrosscity.com.
Okay, that's easy enough.
And it is under maintenance at the moment. So we're working on building out some of these things that we're talking about. So you're getting to see the messy middle. Okay,
good deal. So the messy middle will be up and running at some point in the near future at mycrosscity.com. We're excited about that. So again, Andrew, thank you. David, as always, thank you for your wisdom and insights and experience that you bring to these calls. We want to also thank Nikki, who makes all of this possible. Our next webinar is going to be in August. David and I are going to be talking about the 2022 Giving USA report. We're going to talk about some of the key findings there and some of the strategies or applications that come from those key findings. So we hope you'll be watching your inbox for the invitation to register for that upcoming webinar. Following this call, Nikki is going to send a copy of the recorded version of this webinar to all the people who registered. We're also going to be including with that, hopefully, some of Andrew's documents and opportunities for you to register for a one-day seminar with David and I, where we're going to be going to various churches across the country this fall, talking about how to do planned gift and major gift ministry in your church. In other words, we're going to give you our playbook and show you play by play how we do this. And there's going to be registration links. And if you're on the West Coast, David and I, in fact, are going to be with Andrew doing this at Cross City on September 29. So if you're in the West Coast area and would like to meet Andrew in person, meet David and I in person, we're going to be in Fresno on September 29th, but we're going to be other places as well. So please look at that. So again, on behalf of Mortarstone and Andrew Winger, thank you so much for being with us today. God bless.